Welcome to Your Corporate Shrink podcast. You can engineer human and you can engineer leaders. Here on Your Corporate Shrink, join Elizabeth Frisch, a corporate fixer with a heart of gold, a wicked sense of humor, and a passion to solve pervasive business problems permanently. We will dive into the real issues and opportunities facing companies and government agencies today. Let's get started helping you engineer leaders.
Welcome to the podcast, You Can't Engineer Human. I'm your host, Elizabeth Frisch, and corporate brain hacker. And I'm so pleased today to have a special guest on our call to talk about all things financial, because guess what? Most organizations who get in financial trouble have some clues. So we've got Susan Riley here on the call, who's been the CFO of some well-known companies like TAM Brands, the Dial Corporation, Abercrombie and Fitch, and the Children's Place. She now consults to companies and generally ones in financial distress. And she served and continues to serve on several boards. So she's got firsthand perspective on companies like Ascendant, PJM Interconnection. She was also chair of the board of ComScore and served on the board of DebShops. And she also just stepped down as a member of the board of trustees of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Welcome, Susan, and thank you for coming to the call today. So, money is one of those things that we like to avoid talking about in companies until the crap hits the fan. And so one of the things about these calls is, you know, my listeners, we talk about things raw and straight. And so, Susan, my first question for you on the call today is, what are some of the warning signs that you, as someone who's been on that financial side, what are kind of the things that start nipping at companies that they ignore, and then they need an expert like yourself to come in and help save them, you know, from the horrible stuff? Because I'm sure there's a path that leads to those big breakdowns.
Yeah, I'd say, hi, Elizabeth. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled and honored that you wanted to chat with me this morning. So thank you. I'd say there are a few common threads that you can identify in companies that get into trouble. From a business perspective, I think one common thread is that they lose focus. There are certain things that help the company achieve success, and for a variety of reasons. Could be that the company gets big, could be that management changes, you know, the founder steps down, brings in somebody new. There's a loss of focus. Could be that they do an acquisition and they lose sight of what made them really great in the first place. I also think that for smaller companies that become public companies, the pressure of, you know, having to make earnings, having to report to shareholders quarterly, it takes some getting used to. And there are a set of rules that you have to follow. Those rules are dictated by the SEC. They matter a lot. And if you take that step and become a public company, and you don't ensure that you have an organization that's cognizant of the rules and that's following them, you run a very serious risk of getting into trouble. And once that happens, once something goes wrong along the lines of not, you know, adequately disclosing, not adequately reporting, violating pretty clearly defined rules that the SEC has set forth, it's very, very difficult to recover and can be catastrophic, particularly for some smaller companies that have embarked, you know, that have chosen that path and hadn't been adequately prepared to handle it. So does that help? Would you like to ask a follow-on?
Yeah. So they lose focus. The private to public shift can cause any hiccups. Anything else in like the bookkeeping, how they're keeping the books, how they're tracking the finances, anything else you can think of that end up being landmines that they lose sight of as they grow?
Sure. You know, it's kind of interesting, especially as you look at businesses where you have a strong entrepreneur or owner that knows his or her business backwards and forward, just knows it inherently. When that person lets go and brings in someone that doesn't necessarily have those skills, they're not really sure what the levers are, and identifying and knowing those levers and the what's the word I'm searching for? Milestones or key indicators are it's critically important to know those things, to be able to measure them. Waiting till your books are closed at the end of the month is too late. You've got to know your business, and you've got to have key indicators daily. In some businesses, hourly. In retail, you want to know pretty much by midday whether or not you're on plan or not. And so you need to have systems that are tracking what's happening in your business. And as a leader, you need to understand what that data is, what it means, and really importantly, what you can do about it in real time. I'd say that, in my career, these things, business has the pace of change and the pace of either achieving success or falling out of bed and failing is really fast. And so investing in systems, understanding those systems, and importantly, being able to assimilate what that data is telling you and what you can do about it, in my view, is critically important.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the tensions I experience with my clients between boards and company leadership is getting people to invest in the systems that deliver that data and getting that data to be valued and looked at and communicated. Talk to me a little bit about the board's interaction with the companies. And, sometimes I hear the complaint that, stock prices, that's just all they care about. And so I'm just surviving to the next thing, but then that designs them to fail because they don't have the right stuff. If you're a leader of an organization and answering to a board, what are kind of some of the pitfalls and conversely ways to get the board bought off on investing in some of those levers, which can cost quite a bit of money?
Yeah, first, when I answered your previous questions, I was really answering from the perspective of management, not the board. And boards, it's a really hard position because you're meeting several times a year. You're depending on management to give you indicators of success or failure. It's particularly hard for management teams to talk about things that didn't work out the way they wanted them to with their board, honestly and openly. Frequently, they want to cast as positive a light on whatever it is that's happening as they possibly can. And it's very difficult as a board member to try and get through that, to really understand what the issues are, whether or not there are issues that the board needs to really understand and focus on. It's almost, it's like, what is management telling me? But importantly, you have to train yourself to think, what is it that they're telling me that informs me of what they're not telling me? And that's especially true in a downturn. That's especially true when, again, things aren't quite what they thought they were going to be. And I think the onus is on, in my view, again, the onus is on boards to ensure that they're creating an environment where management can talk about the things that worked, and more importantly, I'd say, the things that didn't work, to look at the things that didn't work and understand what they could learn from that. And boards need to challenge management to understand, what didn't happen the way you thought, what went wrong here, what can you do about it, without trying to, cover it up or whitewash it in such a way that management is concerned that the board is losing respect for them, which is not the case. You have to be able to engage in open two-way dialogue about the things that you really would rather not talk about. It's fun to go to a board meeting and show up, meet in committees for a couple of days, and then meet as a board and go home and everything's fine. But the uncomfortable conversations are the ones, in my view, that are in fact the most important. And again, creating an environment where you're not blaming, but trying to understand so that you can participate and help with with appropriate solutions. I would say, in terms of the second part of your question about encouraging management and businesses to invest in systems and technology and in whatever it takes to give management real-time information about what's happening in their business, is more important than it's ever been. Whether it's investing in a computer system, it doesn't always have to be a huge investment. It has to be creating mechanisms whereby management is really close to the levers, whatever it is that's making their business, again, either successful or not. In retail, we look at, turnover. We're looking at sales every minute, every hour, every day, comparing that, then drilling down into what's selling, what's not selling. What do you do about what's not selling? Do you mark it down? Do you hold tight because you're expecting a change in your business? I mean, there are a ton of questions that you're deriving from information that you're in fact getting. Every business is different, but it's knowing, and then knowing what you can do to effectuate change and what you can't do. That's the job. That's management's job. That's not the board's job. The board's job is to ensure that that they can engage in discussion, that they can get financial statements from management, and importantly, key indicators, so that they have a good grip on the true health of the business that the shareholders have entrusted them to manage from a shareholder perspective. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, so you bring up there's an interesting tension, right? And you've gotten to serve on both sides of that equation, answering two boards as well as being a board member. And so if you were to advise a CEO or leadership on building a good relationship with your board, what would that entail? What does that look like? Because like I said, I always get complaints, and, management tries to put lipstick on a pig because the CEO is worried if he doesn't show the right numbers, he might get laid off. But that's so counterproductive long term. What do you say, as someone who's been on both sides of the fence, how do you build a great relationship with your board as the leader of a company?
I'd say that it's not, you want to create a relationship that is mutually respectful. And I'd say that as a director, you know when there's something that's being presented and, to use your words, they're trying to put lipstick on a pig. And that becomes, it's a little patronizing, it's a little annoying, and that creates tension because the onus is then on the board to have to probe and ask questions. And the intent is not to embarrass. The intent is to understand. And I'd say as a CEO, a CEO should know what discussions are occurring at the board level. And that's a respect that management and the directors, the members of the board, owe that CEO. So having said that, the CEO should not feel that he or she needs to be a part of every single discussion. Typically, the committee that where those discussions occur is audit committee. And I'd say as a board member, I've chaired several audit committees. I always feel very strongly about having private sessions with the CFO and the audit committee, with the external auditors and the audit committee, and with the head of internal audit and the audit committee, because you want to create as a director, you want to create an environment where they can speak freely. And we'll ask the question point blank, is there anything here that you feel you need to tell us? We ask the CFO, are there any issues that you want to communicate to us in private session? We ask the external auditors. We want to know whether or not they're seeing red flags. We want to know from the head of internal audit, Are there any issues? Are there any concerns that you as the head of internal audit have about your ability to complete these internal audits and effectuate change that you need to effectuate? Are you seeing issues with Sarbanes-Oxley? So it kind of creates an environment where the board develops an understanding as to whether or not undue pressure might be being asserted, which happens in companies. It happens a lot, and that's why a lot of companies do in fact get into trouble. So again, I'll stop and I'll see if you have a follow-on.
Yeah. So you talk about undue pressures. Can you expand on that a little bit? Just be really specific. Is like, what is it that causes companies to make bad choices? Where are they seeing things? And especially, younger companies may fall victim to some things because they're just not used to that environment. So where do you see the pressures, and how does the board help make sure that those don't cause a hiccup or a uh-oh from the compliance side?
Okay, so undue pressure in my mind is CEO. Look, we all want to look good. And when you're in a public company, it's a fishbowl. You're reporting earnings every quarter. Everyone wants to look good. We want shareholders to applaud and say, great job. You're in some, same stores in retail. Many retailers report same store sales monthly, or though fewer and fewer these days. But there are other indicators that shareholders look at, and people want to, it's a lot more comfortable. It's a lot nicer to be the hero and look good. And so where undue pressure comes in is where a CEO, sometimes a CFO, wants to cross lines with regard to earnings, wants to not have a discussion with the audit committee about, say, some breakdown in internal control that the head of internal audit or that internal audit has uncovered, and they want to try and withhold information. Sometimes it's because they think it's going to get better. Sometimes it's because they simply don't want to have a conversation about something that that wasn't perfect, and they just don't want to have that conversation, which I can certainly sympathize with and understand. The problem is when you cross a line and say, treat something as revenue, because revenue is an important indicator, when the revenue hasn't truly been earned or should not technically be recorded as revenue, frequently things don't get better the next quarter. Frequently what's happened is, there is a downturn. I've often said that I think the hardest thing to identify in any business is when you hit bottom and can start an upward trajectory. You don't know. And the biggest mistake you can make is thinking your problem is temporary and that it's going to go away. And again, with public companies, once you file that 10Q, once you have that conversation, your earnings call with your shareholders, and you make a statement, it's there. It can't be taken back. So if you make a statement that's untrue on the assumption that your business is going to get better, and it doesn't, you can't undo what's been done. And that's where a lot of companies get into trouble. They've recognized revenue that they shouldn't have recognized. That creates distrust with their external auditors. When that becomes known, frequently, again, look at companies that have had to do earnings restatements, the stock price plummets, and smaller companies that don't have adequate financial resources can be brought to the brink of going out, filing for bankruptcy, because the cost of undoing that action it's just astronomical. Again, you have distrust with your external auditors, you have distrust with your board, you frequently have to change management, and frequently CEOs, frequently CFOs. And I would say that a commonality with those companies is an environment where they've not been open to having conversations, true and open conversations about not only what's working, but what's not working with their board. And I'd say the onus is on both. The onus is on the CEO and the management team, but the onus is also really on the board to foster an environment where those conversations are encouraged, and I'll stop there and just say are encouraged and mandated.
And I think I love that you brought that up, because when I get called in under, your corporate shrink to work with boards and CEOs, it's because that relationship is completely broken. And it's become this game of hide and seek between the board and the leadership. And you're right, it's like a snowball, it starts as a little, snowball, and it's an avalanche by the time it gets down the hill. And I think it's so important, because I've gone into companies that are just brand spanking new to giant global companies. And you're right, the minute they misstate, the minute they claim something, the minute they go down that slippery slope, it only gets worse. And at some point, everybody gets caught, because you can't hide the funny money, and bad things happen and bankruptcies happen. So I love that you really focused on that. And I hope everyone listening on this call, if you don't have that relationship with your board, work on it or get help to create it from an outside source. But make sure, board meetings aren't all about just looking beautiful and putting the latest fashion dress on and pretending it's all, sunshine and lollipops. And your board, if you've picked the right board, can really help you solve things. And I know that, Susan, kind of a comment from you on how do you feel about, like, some things I hear back from my CEOs or my CFOs is like, if I put anything up bad, I'm gone. How true is that? Because, like, when I go back and look, I do see some high profile, excisions of removing people. But overall, most boards and that don't just, say they're gone, right? They get a chance to do it. So what do you think about that statement that I hear from some leaders, that it's like, no, it has to be this way because otherwise I'll lose my job? Do you see the data to say that's true, that boards have become so unforgiving that they don't get a chance?
I don't think that's the case. I think that in my experience on boards, what happens, it's in fact almost the opposite. It's when a CEO is so entrenched and they're only going to share good stuff, good things with the board, that the board starts, that's where the rift gets started. We say, okay, you know what, so much, and then something doesn't work out, and then the board feels like they've been had. Whereas I think early on, if a CEO is willing to engage openly in saying, look, here's what worked and here's what didn't work and here's what I'm planning on doing about it, that actually serves to inspire confidence, not the opposite. Knowing that a CEO has identified a problem in their organization and is working to solve it with management team and the board inspires trust and confidence, not the opposite. It's when they'll only communicate the good things and shut boards down when, directors ask questions. And that does happen as well. And I'll circle back on that in a second. But, when they shut directors down for asking probing, and sometimes appropriate, sometimes not, inappropriate questions, that the distrust starts to build. And then when the CEO most needs the board to engage and support them, the board's not there because they're already somewhat mistrustful. And I'll say on, asking probing questions, it's hard for a director to ask deep and probing questions. I mean, again, we're meeting as a group, 5 times, 6, depending on the board, 4, 5, or 6 times a year. We're not involved in the detail of running the business. We're looking at data that's been given to us and trying to ensure that the business is strong and healthy, try and understand where there are issues that we could be helpful, try and, when you're on an audit committee, there are a whole series of things that an audit committee has to, especially the chair, has to really understand about the business to ensure that there's adequate disclosure and, importantly, discussion with the external auditors. And it's complex, but for directors to have to probe to get that information, I'd say that's a red flag for the board members. If a director feels as though they're having to really probe to get open and honest answers, that's a red flag going up, and one that the board should pay attention to.
Now, you bring up something really interesting. You said the words inappropriate feedback. And one of the most interesting requests I had was from a group of a professional women's organization for CEOs, leaders in publicly and privately held companies. And they wanted a whole workshop on how to deal with inappropriate questions. And so you have sat on both sides of the fence. What is the best ways for leaders to deal with questions? Because, you and I both have sat in board meetings where people have said stuff that may be offensive or, said something completely inappropriate. How do you recommend, as leaders of companies, if those questions start getting leveled at you by the board, what's the best way to deal with them?
It's hard. I mean, I've had people ask questions that were, being essentially yelled at. Why didn't you? And, when I was a CFO, and it can get tense. And I try to let that stuff go and understand that the person asking the question is frustrated, and understand their frustration, and just let it go, get past the meeting and move on, because there's no point in really engaging. But it is off-putting, and it does put you in a position where, where you have a less than trusting relationship with the chair of, or a member of the audit committee. And as a CFO, that's not a comfortable position to be in. So I've made decisions about companies that I want to work for, in part based on that. On occasion, I'll just decide to go, do something else somewhere else. Because I felt that as a CFO, I felt I needed to have the support of the board. And if I didn't, and maybe I over internalized it, but an uncomfortable conversation about something that I'm reporting it for a reason, to me was inappropriate. As directors, I've been shut down by other directors on boards where I'm trying to ask a question to get at something, and another director will answer the question. So, well, I wasn't asking you, I was asking the CFO or the CEO, and thank you. I was asking for a reason. Sometimes it's better, in my view, to just, ask a question rather than try and demonstrate how much you know. And sometimes directors want to demonstrate how much they know, as opposed to letting other directors ask a question of management. Sometimes you want to hear how management answers the question. So sometimes the question's as important as the answer.
And so if you're sitting there as a CEO in the room, and let's say you're seeing all this go on, what are some of the things that CEO can do to either bring the conversation back, or how have you seen some of the best CEOs handle that kind of stuff?
I'd say when it comes to board interaction with management, I think the best person to handle that is the chair of the board, and I've seen some chairs do that brilliantly, and generally privately. So generally you let the issue go in the public forum, because you've got an interesting thing. Frequently it's not just the CEO in the room. Frequently it's the whole the whole senior management team. And so you let it go in the public meeting, but then have a private conversation with that director after the fact. I think that board feedback is really important. And I think that's an important role of the board chair to both, at least annually, and some of the better chairs that I've seen do this very effectively, at least annually, have a conversation with each member of the board about what, from that director's perspective, is working, what's not working, what do they like, what best practices do they think the board should be adopting from other boards that they sit on or other experiences that they've had. And then importantly, for the chair to give that director feedback on how other directors view them, what they could do differently, what they could do better. And I think that two-way communication is critical. And I think it works very well to, if you've received feedback that you should hold back when another director asks a question, generally you'll do that as a director the next time such a situation presents itself.
Got it. And switching gears to the other side, if you're a CEO bringing your leadership team to the board, what are some do's and don'ts, rules of thumb that you would give them to prepare them? Especially, a lot of startup companies, that may be the first time that, especially if they've been private, going public, some of them may not have a lot of experience doing that. What would you say is the best advice a leader can give their team to work with the board successfully and report to the board successfully?
I'd say just be yourself, be honest and open. And if you're asked a question, answer that question honestly and openly. And if you don't know something, say, I don't know, I'll follow up. But just look, you wouldn't be in that position if the CEO didn't really believe in you. And so I'd say just answer the questions as honestly and openly as you can. Don't have an agenda. Again, directors, they know. Like, I've also chaired some compensation committees, and directors know when there's an agenda at hand. Be honest. We'll listen. But directors have we've all sat in the shoes of management. We know. And we also know when someone's got an agenda, and that can be, when you're being set up or when you're being played, and that can be somewhat off-putting. So I'm a big believer in open, honest communication. And if you think it, within certain boundaries, you don't just want, free, stream of consciousness dialogue. That's not appropriate either. You want to be concise. You want to be clear. There's a limited time that these meetings, that you have for these meetings. And so if you are going to say something, make it important. Make sure it's important and make sure that it's relevant and that you're truthful and honest.
Awesome. And then before we wrap today, one of the things I always like to leave our listeners with is, out of this call, what's one action they can take to build a really great relationship between the board and the leadership team? Like, if you were just to say, go back tomorrow and do X, what would X be?
I think that's an interesting question. I'd say if you really are working on building that bridge, building that relationship, if I were advising a CEO, I'd try to find an opportunity to engage with each director on your board and get to know that person. Ask their opinion about some critical issue that you're working on. Just ask what they think. People like that. They respond to it. And it goes a long way in building relationships that you hope as a CEO will be there when you need them. Every CEO that I've ever worked with, every CFO that I've worked with, I would say myself, you need these people. You need these directors. And none of us are so great at our jobs that we don't need help and support on occasion. And I'd say, start now, start before you need it. Don't wait till you absolutely need the help before you ask, because it might be too late at that point.
I love that. So everyone on the call, you heard it from someone who knows. Building those relationships with your board members before you need them is so, so critical. So get off this podcast and make a phone call to a board member right after this and get in action on that one. Thank you, Susan, so much for joining our podcast. I loved having you. It's so great to hear from the board perspective and from someone who's been there. And of course, everyone on the call, all our past podcasts, you can find on Apple and Android and on my website at corporateshrink.com. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me. I really appreciate it. And I thought it was, you asked some really terrific questions. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Your Corporate Shrink podcast. You Can't Engineer Human, and you can engineer leaders. With your host, Elizabeth Frisch. Find Elizabeth and her team at yourcorporateshrink.com.